It's a great pleasure to see so many of you in this room and so many of you online. And I know why you've all come. It's of course because of Roman Krznaric, who is, as many of you will know, a very well-known philosopher, although he doesn't really like that particular description of himself, who's also a great friend who's written many books, but his latest one, which is about becoming a good ancestor and really the search for human flourishing, is, I think, what he, not just what I think, it is what he will tell us about today. So I'm expecting a fantastic talk. I'm expecting there will be lots of Christians afterwards. So with no further ado, please, Roman, tell us about how to become a good ancestor.
Thanks very much, Morten. So I would like to tell you about the human relationship with time, and particularly about why we need to expand our time horizon so we can become good ancestors and tackle the urgent challenges of the 21st century. And I want to do that by drawing on some ideas in this book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, and particularly I want to focus on 6 different ways we can think about long-term thinking, kind of a model of thinking about the long term. And to really sort of understand how I got to my thinking about this, I want to just tell you a little bit about my own background. I used to be a political scientist, and by the way, I'll talk about 50 minutes or something like that, and we can have questions afterwards. I might even get you talking to each other for a bit in the middle. So I used to be a political scientist more than 20 years ago, and I left academia because I wanted to study empathy, particularly the role that empathy could play in social and political change, especially, what's sometimes called cognitive empathy or perspective-taking empathy, stepping into other people's shoes. And in order to start exploring that, one of the things I did is I started working with an Oxford-based historian called Theodore Zeldin, who's a sort of pioneer in the study of the history of the emotions. If you haven't read his book, An Intimate History of Humanity, I recommend it. And he founded an organization called the Oxford Muse that you can see there on the screen. And the Oxford Muse was invented to create conversations between strangers. So we did things like put on conversation meals, which you can see there, where we'd invite strangers to a meal, but instead of giving them a menu of food, we gave them a menu of conversation with questions about life on it, like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? So it's like the opposite of speed dating. You talk for 2 hours, not for 2 minutes. After that, I was one of the founding faculty members of an organization called the School of Life with the philosopher Alain de Botton. This was all about human flourishing. I was trying to bring these ideas around empathy and social change into it. And then I wrote a book about empathy called Empathy, A Handbook for Evolution, later retitled by my publishers against my wishes as Empathy, Why It Matters and How to Get It. Seemed a bit antithetical to the message I was trying to send. And then I founded a museum called the Empathy Museum, which you may have heard about, because I think Claire Patey came and spoke here a while ago, and Morten and I are both on the board of the Empathy Museum, which was about trying to give people experiences of stepping into other people's shoes. But all the time I was doing this work on empathy over the last 15 years or more, there was a question niggling at the back of my mind, which is most of the stepping into the shoes of others I was thinking about and getting engaged in and writing about was about here and now in today's world. It was sort of empathy across space, whether trying to step in the shoes of people living on the streets of Kali Road or having experienced an earthquake in China. And what I wasn't really addressing very much was empathy through time, or how do we try and step into the shoes of people in future generations? How do we try and connect in some way across the decades, beyond even our own lifetimes? And that's why I wrote this book, in a way, The Good Ancestor, to try and deal with that. And it seems that question of how to connect through time matters for 2 fundamental reasons. One is that human flourishing, we know, is about social connection. That's fundamental to it. But we tend to think about that social connection being in the here and now, with friends, families, loved ones, strangers now. But we are also deeply intergenerational beings, of course. That human connection and that meaning extends through time. I mean, most of us probably know our parents, might have known our grandparents. If we have children, we might come to know our grandchildren. And there we are already in a middle of 5 generations, a 5-generational sandwich. And if you think about the date or the year when your grandmother was born, and the year your grandchild might die, well, that could be 250 years. That's centuries of love and emotional connection and meaning right there. So I think that thinking about ourselves in relation to time is important because that's who we are, but also because we are at a moment in history where we have been severed, particularly in the Western world, severed from this kind of intergenerational connection by the hyper-individualism we've inherited from the last couple of centuries. We're a bit like, in Philip Pullman's Dark Material novels, the children who get cut from their demons. We're a bit like that. But I also think this question of connecting through time matters on the level of not individual flourishing, but species flourishing. That it's important that if we want to thrive as a species, flourish as a species, but also survive as a species, we need to start thinking beyond the here and now. We need to think about the impacts of our actions on future people, future planet. So the question there is, to me, how do we develop our capacity to think over the long term? How do we go about doing that? Well, I think it's worth situating ourselves for a start in this moment in the human story. And I believe that we live in an age of chronic short-termism. Our politicians can't see beyond the next election. Businesses can't see beyond the quarterly report, as you can see reported there on the screen. Nations sit around international conference tables, bickering with each other while the planet burns and species disappear, as we've seen in COP27 in Egypt just a couple of weeks ago. Stock markets spike, then crash in speculative bubbles, and of course, as individuals, we're, looking at our phones and clicking on the buy now button. This is the age of the tyranny of the now. And it's clear that we need more long-term thinking to deal with a whole range of challenges facing humanity. We need to be thinking more long-term about planning for the next pandemic that might be coming our way, thinking about dealing with the impacts of racial injustice and wealth inequality, which gets passed on from generation to generation, dealing with threats from new technologies, artificial intelligence, lethal autonomous weapons, and of course to deal with the impacts of the global ecological crisis, which is here now already, but it is only going to get more and more damaging to us. So we need more long-term thinking. Of course, I'm not saying that short-term thinking has no role. When my daughter broke her leg, I rushed her straight to the hospital, and we often need that in society too. There's a war, we must respond to it. But the need for, or the bias against the long term is deeply embedded in all our cultural, social, political institutions. And the way I think about this problem in a way is through a metaphor, which is the idea that humankind, particularly in the global north, we've colonized the future. That we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And it's a little bit like the way when Britain colonized Australia in the 18th, 19th century. I'm Australian, by the way. When Britain colonized Australia, they drew on a legal doctrine now known as terra nullius, nobody's land. The idea that there were no indigenous people there and it was just theirs for the taking. Of course, there were people there. And in a sense, we treat the future a little bit like that. It's kind of the future's not a terra nullius, but a tempus nullius, a sort of nobody's time, an empty place. But of course, it's full of all the generations of the future. And the tragedy, in a way, is those future generations aren't here to do anything about our pillaging of their inheritance. They can't go on a salt march to defy their colonial oppressors like Mahatma Gandhi. They can't stage a sit-in like a civil rights activist or throw themselves in front of the King's horse like a suffragette. In a way, we need to do that for them. And I think the problem is kind of captured by this cartoon here, which is, there up in the attic are all the things that we're dumping on the future. Colonial racism, debt, environmental problems, so on. And that's the crap we inherited, that's our crap, we'll let the grandkids sort it out. I think that's very much our attitude. And it's hard, though, to grasp, I think, the scale of this sort of injustice that we're dumping on the future. One of the ways I think about it, amongst others, is with this sort of image from my book, The Scale of Unborn Generations, which is the idea that there are about 8 billion of us alive today. That's the small green circle of the living. Over the last 50,000 years, if we start thinking really long term, an estimated 100 billion people have been born and died, and then over the next 50,000, if this century's birth rates level off and stabilize, maybe nearly 7 trillion people will be born. So there in that big orange circle are your grandchildren and their grandchildren and all the friends and communities on whom they'll depend. In the next couple of decades alone, tens of billions of people will be born. There's a real question there of how will they remember us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance. And someone who really thought about this issue a lot was the immunologist Jonas Salk, who you might know developed the first polio vaccine in the 50s. But in later life, he said the great question facing human civilization is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, are we going to be remembered well? How can we be remembered well by the generations to come? Because he was seeing already in the 1970s our impacts, our environmental impacts, the threat of nuclear weapons, and so on. And he believed that if we were going to become good ancestors, we needed to expand our time horizons. And instead of thinking on the scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we needed to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and even beyond that. You might think, well, that's very difficult for human beings, isn't it? Well, yes and no. I mean, we are gifted with a capacity to dance across time with our minds. We operate on multiple time horizons. A lot of our life is on that level of seconds and minutes and hours, clicking the buy now button, watching the 24/7 news in private life, public life. But we also do stuff which is very long term. We save for our pensions. We plant seeds in the ground. Countries build flood defenses for the future. So we operate on these different levels. We are experts in a way at the temporal pirouette. One moment you can be looking at your phone, and next moment you can be thinking about saving for your children's education or something like that. And the way I think about this, how we operate on different time horizons, is I think about our capacity for what I call marshmallow thinking and acorn thinking. Right? So the marshmallow thinking we do is obviously the one about short-term rewards, immediate gratification, named of course after the famous marshmallow test in the 1960s, little kids did. But what we tend to neglect is also our capacity for that kind of acorn thinking and acorn mindset, which is what enables us to think and plan and strategize over the long term. Humans are actually pretty good at this compared to most other creatures. So, chimpanzees plan ahead a bit. They'll get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week, right? But that's what human beings do. That's how and why we write song lists for our own funerals, or that's how we built the Great Wall of China. We were using this kind of acorn capacity. And there's kind of emerging fields of research around this, about our capacity for mental time travel. One of these fields is prospective psychology, as it's sometimes called. So Martin Seligman and others have been writing in this area for a few years. So Seligman and his colleagues talk about the idea of homo prospectus. That's a definition of kind of who we are or what makes us stand out from other species. It's about our unrivaled human ability to be guided by imagining alternatives stretching into the future. And the kind of research that you find in books like this is just one example by Roy Baumeister and colleagues. You might know him more for his work on willpower, but he's also done stuff on thinking about who we are through time. And so if you read this paper, it talks about this well-known study in Chicago where 500 people, they were given a mobile app and it beeped at various times during the day, and they had to say what they were thinking about. And it turned out that about 14% of the time people were thinking about the future, only about 4% of the time thinking about the past. The rest of the time was either thinking about the present or kind of non-time determined. So it's interesting, they're thinking more about the future, mostly about planning for the future, but of that thinking about the future, about 4/5 of it was about thinking about stuff going on today or tomorrow. Very, very little of it was about a year's time, 10 years' time, 100 years' time. So, yeah, we're homo prospectus, but we don't prospect very far. And so that really raises the question, well, how do we get better at doing this? What would it take? And just like there's a struggle going on in our own minds between the acorn and the marshmallow, do we sort of party today or save for our pensions for tomorrow? Do we upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? Just as there's this tug of war goes on in our minds, there's a tug of war going on in society between what I think of as 6 drivers of short-term thinking and 6 ways to think long-term. And these 6 ways to think long-term are sourced from lots of different disciplines, from anthropology and economics and psychology and history and so on. 6 drivers of short-termism, some of those will be pretty familiar to you. The ideas of digital distraction or speculative capitalism. Maybe less familiar, for example, is the importance of the tyranny of the clock, the way that clock time has speeded up our experience of time for more than 500 years. You know, the first clocks in medieval Europe in the 14th century used to chime maybe once an hour or once every 15 minutes. But by 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, most clocks had second hands. And of course, the clock became the key machine of the Industrial Revolution, keeping the assembly line moving. And of course, we now have nanosecond speed share trading. But in a way, the future has been rushing towards us faster and faster as clock time has been speeding up. So this is not just a question, you know, dealing with the problems of short-termism isn't just about putting our phones away. You know, there's many, many other factors which are driving the tyranny of the now. But I want to say something now just about these 6 ways to think long-term. I think of them as a kind of a cognitive toolkit for long-term thinking. So the first one I want to start with is the idea of cathedral thinking, which is the idea of making plans, going decades ahead, maybe beyond your own lifetime. Especially it's, you know, named, of course, after the way that cathedrals and other medieval buildings often took hundreds of years to build, and those who laid the first foundation stones maybe never saw them finished within their own lifetimes. There's lots of different kinds of cathedral thinking. So in my book, I document at least, you know, sort of 50 examples or more in different realms: religious buildings, infrastructure like buildings of the Great Wall of China, or canals, or scientific endeavors, and so on. Let me just say something about 3 of these. I mean, just to give you a bit of a flavor. So, of course, on the left there is a classic cathedral example. That's actually Ulm Minster in southwest Germany. It was started in 1377. It wasn't finished until the year 1890. It was kind of one of the world's longest crowdfunding projects. It was funded by local citizens. You also see this in public policy and infrastructure. So down the bottom there, you can see a photograph of the sewers built in Victorian London after the famous Great Stink of 1858, when raw sewage had been dumped in the Thames for years. Tens of thousands of people would die each year of cholera and other diseases. And finally, when the stench got so bad that even members of Parliament couldn't breathe in the long hot summer of 1858, they finally passed the emergency legislation to build the sewers over the next 19 years. And the thing about the sewers is that they were built twice as big as they needed to be at the time. They used very expensive bricks, they used a new kind of cement, Portland cement. They were really long-term thinking. And that's why those sewers are still in use today. If you walk down the embankment in London, you're walking, of course, over those sewers that were built in the 1860s. And then I just also want to just highlight in the top right there the idea that cathedral thinking is also expressed in collective action, in social movements. So the first suffragette organisation was formed in 1867 in Manchester. Well, it took more than half a century to achieve the core aims of the movement. And social movements tend to be like that. They take decades. So we need to remember that we have this amazing capacity, in a way, that we often don't think about for cathedral thinking. And we see it expressed today, for example, in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, you might know about, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle, which is designed to last for 1,000 years. It's like a botanical Noah's Ark. Another example is the Greenbelt movement in Canada, started in the 1970s by Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work, which has planted tens of millions of trees over the decades. It's still going strong now. They've trained tens of thousands of women in agroforestry skills. They work in more than 4,000 communities across sub-Saharan Africa. But this is all about long-term thinking, long-term planning as a kind of social movement, leaving a legacy for the future. But I would say that long-term thinking and cathedral thinking isn't always good for us. It can be put towards narrow and self-serving ends. I mean, Hitler wanted an 1,000-year Reich, or a former head of Goldman Sachs, investment banker, once said, we're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy. In other words, this isn't about all those future cestus in that big orange circle. This is about what's going to happen to the share price over the long term. So cathedral thinking isn't enough by itself. We need more than that. And that brings me on to intergenerational justice, which is the idea of, well, what kind of responsibilities should we have for future generations? What rights should they have? How do we give future generations a voice in our current decision-making structures and political systems? And that's a question which I particularly like, because I used to lecture about democracy. And it never once occurred to me that we failed to give any voice to future generations in all my years of writing research papers and all this stuff. It took me at least 2 decades to suddenly think, oh my God, there's something missing here in the picture. But it's good to see that there's a lot of interesting work and action going on in this area. You might know, for example, that in Wales, there's a public position called the Future Generations Commissioner. And her job is to look at the impact of public policy up to 30 years in the future in areas of unemployment, and employment, and transport, and healthcare, and education, and so on. The commissioner doesn't have a lot of power, but there is sort of some movement in that area. You find, I think, a lot of good, sort of a foundation for thinking about intergenerational justice in many indigenous cultures, ideals of ecological stewardship, or what sometimes called seventh generation decision making. So here's a quote from Oren Lyons from the Haudenosaunee, or what used to be called the Iroquois people. He says, "We are looking ahead, as is one of the first mandates given to us as chiefs, to make sure every decision we make relates to the welfare and well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" It's saying something about human flourishing. And meaning is about communities that stretch through time and passing on something at least as good as what you inherited to the next generation, a kind of intergenerational golden rule. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, not just today, but do unto future generations how you would wish they would do unto you. So you might look at that and think, okay, well, that's a nice idea from indigenous philosophy, cosmology, but how do we bring that into today's world? And there's a really interesting example in Japan called the Future Design Movement, which is directly inspired by this Native American idea of seventh generation decision making, which also exists in other cultures. And what they do, and it's very much about intergenerational justice and giving future generations a voice. What they do is they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. And they typically divide them into 2 groups. Half are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these lovely orange kind of kimono cloaks to wear, and I have one here. This is from the small town of Yahaba in Japan. Population 30,000. And the people who are given the robes are told to imagine themselves not as residents from the present day, but residents from the year 2060. So to throw their minds forward, imagine 40 years ahead, roughly that. And it turns out that residents from 2060 systematically advocate for far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's action on climate change or dealing with an aging population or threats from automation. The future design movement is now spreading throughout Japan. This methodology is used in the Ministry of Finance, in big companies, in big cities like Kyoto. And in fact, I was in touch with the founder of Future Design a couple of days ago, Tatsuyoshi Saijo. He's a game theory economist. And I said, I was coming to talk here to you. And he said, you must tell them about the research that we've been doing with neuroscientists. So Future Design, people behind it have been starting to work with some neuroscientists saying, well, what might be, how does long-term imagining of this kind operate in the human brain? So that paper is one just sort of trying to map out a research program. The one on the left draws on some of the work of Future Design to try and at least start thinking about what might be the neuroscientific underpinnings of this kind of long-term collective imagining. And I'm sure there's a ton more research that could be done in this area. These are just early days yet. Another project apart from Future Design, which I think is important for thinking about intergenerational responsibility and intergenerational justice, is this, which is Roots of Empathy. Have any of you ever heard of Roots of Empathy? Right, yeah, a couple of you. So as you may know, for those of you who have heard of it, this is a program about teaching empathy, which started in Canada in the late 1990s, started by someone called Mary Gordon. And it's amazing, because it works. What they do is I've been and seen it in Toronto actually, in a sort of quite a rough inner city school in Toronto. What they do is they invite a local baby to visit a school. And the baby visits the school every 3 weeks. The baby is the teacher of empathy. And if you look close on the t-shirt, it actually says teacher on it. So it's Roots of Empathy, like roots of a tree. Anyway, so the baby comes to visit the class, usually kids between the age of 5 and 12. They roll out the green mat, put the baby in the middle, the kids sit around the baby, and they start talking about the baby. Why is the baby crying? Why is the baby laughing? Why is the baby suddenly looking up at the mother or father? They're trying to step into the baby's shoes, trying to understand the baby's view of the world. And they use that as a jumping off point for then talking about, well, what's it like to be a kid bullied in the playground? What's it like to be a family sleeping on the streets of Calcutta? And the research, has been a ton of research around roots of empathy. I partly like this example because so much good research has been done on its impacts on increasing affective and cognitive empathy and cooperation in the playground, reducing bullying, even increasing general academic attainment in maths and literacy. But one of the other things they do, and they don't do a huge emphasis on this, but they do talk about future generations. They get the kids to think about what responsibilities do we have to this baby in the future? What will this baby's life be like in the future? What does that mean for what we do, who we are, how we act? So that is another route into a kind of an experiential project to try and develop this connection through time. Let me now say something about a third way to think about long-term thinking, which is the idea of developing a legacy mindset. This is really going to the heart of what Jonas Salk was talking about being a good ancestor, about what legacies we want to leave. And this is also about death, of course. You know, in a way, the fact that we are mortal is good in this sense, because most human beings, by the time they reach middle age, roughly, start thinking about what legacy they want to leave when they're gone. There's a whole sort of psychology field around this called generativity. The thing is, though, when people think about the legacies they want to leave, they think about it in very different ways. So partly, some people think about it in a very egoistic way. You know, they want to have a football stadium named after them, or a wing of the National Gallery like a Russian oligarch. Or it's a bit like Alexander the Great wanted statues of himself, you know, left all over his empire. So there's a kind of an egoistic form of legacy. There's a familial form of legacy, which I think is quite common. We want to leave things to our own children, grandchildren, loved ones, whether it's family heirlooms or wealth or a home. But I think to be a good ancestor, we need to step beyond that and start thinking about, well, how do we leave a universal legacy, a legacy to the universal strangers of the future? And that's tough, because partly because we have been severed off, I think, in many ways from a larger sense of connection that, you know, many cultures, you know, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Maori culture, there's this sense. I once went to a talk by a Maori activist who talked about how when she was speaking, this was actually in All Souls, and she said, you know, which was like a sort of a colonial hive hotspot. And she was saying, you know, here I am, and I feel my ancestors with me. I feel like the dead, the living, and the unborn are all here in the room with me. And I was thinking to myself, I don't think that. You know, for me, I don't feel that sense of connection. So how do we get that? How do we get a touch of that if you haven't come from that kind of culture where that intergenerational embeddedness is still so strong? And in order to do that, or to help us along that our way, I want us to do a little experiment, a little thought journey. So I'd like you all to stand up, if you would. This will just take a couple of minutes. And if you're watching online, also stand up and try and make sure you've got a tiny bit of space in front of you. And this is a little exercise called Human Layers, developed by an organization called the Long Time Project in London. So it's about connecting through the generations. So just want you to just close your eyes for a moment and just take a deep breath. And when you just imagine the face of a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or your child or grandchild, someone you care about. Just picture their face. And now just take a tiny step forward. You've now traveled 30 years into the future. Again, I want you to picture that young person's face, but now 30 years from today. What do they look like? What's the sound of their voice? What are the joys in their life and the struggles they might be facing? And now just take a final small step forward. It's now their 90th birthday party. They're 90 years old, surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and old work colleagues and neighbors. Go and have a look out the window. What kind of world do you see out there? And now come back in and you notice this 90-year-old standing up, and they're about to give a birthday speech. When suddenly they see a photograph of you, their dead departed ancestor, over on the table, and they decide instead to give a speech to talk about what this departed ancestor left to their generation, something that this departed person did to be a good ancestor. Just think for a moment about what they said about you in their speech and what you did. And now just open your eyes again and come back to the present moment, and please sit down. Just to absorb that a little, what I would like you to do now is, only when I give you the signal. When I give you the signal, I want you to get into a pair with somebody next to you or behind you. I want you to just spend 2 minutes, just 2 minutes talking about this question. What did that exercise make you think, and what did it make you feel? What did it make you think, and what did it make you feel? And for those who are watching online, since you haven't got someone next to you to talk to, probably just get out a piece of paper and a pencil and just do 2 minutes of automatic writing, unconscious writing about what you thought and what you felt doing that. Just write whatever comes to your mind, just for you. You don't have to show it to anybody. So on the count of 3, I would like you to get into a pair and start talking for 2 minutes. What did that make you think? What did it make you feel? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, could I have your attentions again, please? I like your disobedience. I remember when I first did that exercise, I was out in a field in Kent a few years ago, and I had this kind of realization, which was interesting. I was thinking about my daughter, who was then 10, and I guess one of the things I realized was that she could easily be alive in the year 2100. You know, that future wasn't science fiction, it was an intimate family fact. But the other thing I realized, and it still kind of makes my head stand kind of when I think about it, was I realized that in that future, she's not alone, floating in space like this baby on the screen. She's part of a web of human relationships, and also a web of relationships in the living world, the water she drinks and the air she breathes. So what I saw, it's going to sound obvious, but it wasn't at the time, which was that if I care about her life in the future, I need to care about all life. In other words, when you think about legacy, starting with something quite personal can be a bridge to something more universal. And in fact, when I'm giving talks, for example, to politicians, CEOs, or whoever, community groups, whatever, I often get them to do this exercise. Because it's a way of sort of cutting through beyond left and right, or wherever they sit politically, or whatever, you know, because most people have people in their life, young people who they do care about, might care about. And it's a sort of a bridge to then talking about more technical topics like the economics of discounting with people from the Treasury or whatever it happens to be. But I also realize that that kind of thinking, doing something like that, can also take you to dark places depending on what you see outside that window, you know, and that can be very confronting and something that can be difficult to sit with. I mean, I really like some artistic projects which try and, I think, explore this sense of legacy and intergenerational connection in different ways. One of them I just want to talk about for a moment is something called the Future Library, you may have heard of, from the Scottish artist Katie Patterson, where every year for 100 years, the next 100 years, a famous author is depositing a book in this future library, which will remain completely unread until the year 2114, at which point the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which will be planted in a forest outside Oslo. So Han Keng, Margaret Atwood, Elif Shafak and others have donated to this library. So, you know, Margaret Atwood's given a book that she will never see published in her lifetime. None of her fans will ever be able to read it. It is a gift to the future. And I think that's a question for all of us, right? You know, what are the gifts we are going to leave to those generations to come? Helping us, and I think something like this helps us connect with the strangers of the future. Now, holistic forecasting is a slightly more technical area. I won't say that much about it, but a lot of thinking about the future has been captured by the corporate world through mechanisms such as scenario planning, things like that. So a lot of corporations started doing scenario planning for future outcomes or variable future outcomes in the 1970s and 80s. And in a way, thinking about the future became all about what would happen over, say, the next 3 or 5 or maybe 10 years, and how that would help them sell more stuff or get more market share. Luckily, the climate scientists came along and started helping expand the nature of forecasting. So if you pick up a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you'll see forecasts on sea level rises going 100, 200, even 500 years in the future. So the way we're thinking about the future is being stretched by forecasting. And I think that's very important because we need to think about what is coming our way rather than just responding immediately in the present. But I think we need to get even larger than that, and certainly get beyond the corporate forecasting to what I think of as holistic forecasting, thinking about the rise and fall of whole civilizations. And what does that look like? In my book, I talk about some really interesting research by a guy at Cambridge called Luke Kemp, who looked at what is the average lifespan, he asked, of an ancient civilization. He looked at about 90 of them, from the Sumerians and Assyrians and Babylonians and the Roman Empire and so on. And his conclusion was that the average civilization lasts just over 3 centuries, 336 years. Quite precise, but his point really was not about the precision. It was about making the point that civilizations rise, they flower, and they die. That is the human story. And that raises a question about, well, what is the trajectory of our own civilization? What direction is it going in? And I think if we're going to address that issue and think about how do we not become like the Roman Empire or the Mayans and die out, then we need to think about the fifth way of thinking long term, which is the idea of pursuing a transcendent goal, a goal that goes beyond ourselves. Now, we often think about this on the level of the individual. So if you read, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about how human meaning comes from having goals outside ourselves, or what he sometimes calls a concrete assignment in some of the works, different phrases are used. But we need to then also ask, well, what should our goal be as a species? What is all this long-term thinking for? What are we really trying to achieve with cathedral thinking and intergenerational justice and all these various things I'm talking about? What's the lodestar which should guide us? Now, if you look at modern culture, certain goals for the human species tend to be on offer. So if you pick up a book by someone like Steven Pinker, he'll say, well, the goal is endless economic growth, modernization, everything getting better and better. But we know, even my children know, that that's an impossibility, that you can't keep blowing up a balloon thinking that it's never going to go and pop. It is going to pop, right? That there is no systematic evidence that we can have, say, constant GDP growth, which is the dream of lots of people down in the economics department, that we can have green growth or sustainable growth or some kind of variety of growth from your local delicatessen, that it's all about growth, because we know that there is no systematic evidence that we can decouple GDP growth from either carbon emissions or material footprint and anything like the speed and scale required to stay below, say, 1.5 degrees of heating, what's called absolute, what's the technical term? Absolute sufficient decoupling. So not just CO2 not going up quite as much as GDP growth, but actually falling enough. It's a big ask. So that that dream of endless growth, I think, is not the goal we should be aiming for. Elon Musk might want to have another goal, which is getting onto Mars. But the way I think about that, there's a lot of people who have thought about that. So that should be our goal. We need to inhabit other worlds. The great astronomer Carl Sagan said, that is the destiny of humankind, to spread ourselves over the universe. But I guess the way I think about it is in terms of sort of mountaineering. If you talk to a mountaineer, they always say that before you go up a risky peak, make sure your base camp is in order. Right? But our base camp is not in order. We haven't learned to live within the boundaries of base camp Earth yet. And I sort of think, well, once we've learned to do that, sure, go off to Mars, have a nice time, but not before that. And so that what takes me onto the transcendent goal we should be aiming for, which is, I think of as one planet thriving, living within the boundaries of this one planet we know that sustains life. This is the core of the field of, say, ecological economics. You might know just a couple of weeks ago, the great founder, one of the great founders of ecological economics, Herman Daly, died. And his basic idea was, look, the economy doesn't exist on a white background that you get in an economics textbook where you're shown demand and supply or the circular flow of income. There's a circle you have to draw around it, which is the biosphere. And that if we want to survive over the long term, then we can't use more resources than are naturally generated by our planet, and you can't create more waste that can be naturally absorbed. Obvious, right? But of course that's not how most of our economies work or how economics is taught, and so on. And someone who I've found really helpful thinking about this is a biologist and forestry expert, actually, and designer called Janine Benyus, who's the inventor of the concept of biomimicry, about learning from nature's 3.8 billion years of R&D. She's done a really good TED Talk, really good book on biomimicry. And I want to just play you a 1-minute clip from a talk she gave, which I think gives us an insight into how we can survive over the long term. And as you'll see, that this is as much about place as it is about time.
You know, the answers we seek, the secrets to a sustainable world, are literally all around us. And if we choose to truly mimic life's genius, the future I see would be beauty and abundance, and certainly fewer regrets. You know, in the natural world, the definition of success is the continuity of life. You keep yourself alive and you keep your offspring alive. That's success. But it's not the offspring in this generation. Success is keeping your offspring alive 10,000 generations and more. And that presents a conundrum because you're not going to be there to take care of your offspring 10,000 generations from now. So what organisms have learned to do is to take care of the place that's going to take care of their offspring. Life has learned to create conditions conducive to life. And that's really the magic heart of it. Life creates conditions conducive to life. And that's also the design brief for us right now. We have to learn how to do that. And luckily, we're surrounded by the answers, and millions of species willing to gift us with their best ideas.
I remember when I first came across Janine Benyus' work and that clip and her book, and it completely blew my mind, because I'd just spent the last 3 years thinking about how do we start thinking, 100 years from now and 1,000 years from now. And she was saying, wait, just stop. Maybe you don't have to think about time, you just have to think about place. It's about not fouling the nest. That's how bats, beavers, and birds have survived for 10,000 generations or more. And human beings do the opposite, right? We foul the nest. Right? That's what we've become experts in over the last century. And as she puts it, and she came to stay with us just a few weeks ago, a couple of months ago actually, she said, it's about falling in love with rivers and mountains and ice sheets and savannas. And she, in one of her books, she quotes, there's this Mohawk saying, which is apparently spoken when a child is born. It's, "Thank you, Earth, you know the way." And I think that in a way captures what she's trying to say about the goal. The goal is to not foul the nest. If we do that, that's the best way we care about the generations, we can care for the generations to come. How do we then express that in the world? Well, I think one way is through having kind of models which can give us the goals that we need as a society. And one I write about in my book is the donut of social and planetary boundaries developed by the ecological economist Kate Raworth, who I have to admit is also my wife. But this model is also endorsed by the Pope and David Attenborough and so on. So it's one of the sort of main alternatives to the GDP growth obsession. And if you probably know this model, but if you don't, it's shaped like a donut, the only kind that's good for you, as she says. And it's about bringing people out above a social foundation. So imagine right in the middle is a place of ultimate human deprivation. But the idea is we want to bring people above a social foundation in terms of water, food, energy, healthcare, and so on. Those are sourced from the Sustainable Development Goals. But bring people above the social foundation, but without blowing ourselves outside that environmental ceiling, which are formed by the 9 planetary boundaries developed by Earth system scientists like Johan Rockstrom and Will Stefan and others. A really important paradigm, climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on. So we want to be in that safe and just space between. It's not about endless growth, it's about thriving in balance. And this is our global selfie. I mean, we are failing as a global civilization to meet social foundation in all these different areas, as you can see there. So the bigger the sort of red sector is, the bigger the amount of the shortfall of deprivation. We're also going across at least 4 of the planetary boundaries for which we have data. In fact, they've just done an update of the planetary boundaries model, and so there's now data on chemical pollution, which goes way over, right? And this model's also been downscaled for nations, communities, etc., and it's been used in city planning and country planning around the world. But it's one way of trying to capture that idea of having a meaningful, transcendent goal as a society for our flourishing as a species. And let me now just finish, before we start talking about some of this, by talking about deep time and returning to that question of time. Because I think it's so important to recognize that human beings are just an eye blink in the cosmic story. You know, if the age of the Earth was the distance from your nose to the tip of your outstretched hand, one stroke of a nail file would eradicate the human species and all our 200,000 years that we've been here. It's that short. Yet in that time, we have wrought such destruction. And there's a wonderful quote from Dave Brower, who was one of the founders of the Sierra Club, which tries to sort of capture the importance of that idea of deep time and what we have done in our short time. Here he says, compare the 6 days of the book of Genesis to the 4 billion years of geological time. All day Monday until Tuesday noon, creation was busy getting the earth going. Life began on Tuesday noon, and the beautiful organic wholeness developed over the next 4 days. At 4 p.m. Saturday, the big reptiles. 5 hours later, when the redwoods appeared, there were no more big reptiles. At 3 minutes before midnight, man appeared. 1/4 of a second before midnight, Christ arrived. At 1/40 of a second before midnight, the Industrial Revolution began. We're surrounded by people who think that what we've been doing for 1/40 of a second can go on indefinitely. They are considered normal, but they are stark raving mad. I think they are stark raving mad. But it's very hard, I think, to grasp that sense of deep time. I once spoke to the astronomer royal Martin Rees, and he literally, I think, can feel the billions of years of the universe of the past and the future. You know, that's his thing. I don't feel that. I look at those geological tables showing the Cretaceous and Jurassic, I feel nothing. But actually metaphors like this are one way, I think, of connecting us with time, that sense of deep time. But I want to just finish with one more practical example of how we can etch deep time on our skins to really sort of feel it. And this is, I just want to show you a little 1-minute video clip from a ritual, a deep time ritual, which I've been part of for the last few years. I'm particularly showing this in honor of Morton because it involves a drone, and you may know he loves his drone. So I'm part of a research fellow at a place called the Long Now Foundation, and every year we go to the White Horse of Uffington. You might know it's a 3,000-year-old Bronze Age artwork, about an hour from here. And every year, for hundreds of years, local people will be going up to perform a ritual called re-chalking the horse, because it's chalk underneath. That white horse is 100 meters wide, and people have been going up, taking out the weeds and bashing in new chalk as part of this ritual. And now the National Trust organises people every year to go there and re-chalk the horse. So we go up there, a group of us who are interested in the long term, and we take part in this ritual. And that's the closest I've come to really feeling deep time. But it also raises really interesting questions of maintenance. You know, what do we want to preserve in society, and what do we want to let go of? But it is, I think, ultimately about giving meaning to the idea of deep time. So I think just to finish, I'd say that look, when we think about human flourishing, let's think not just about flourishing here and now or across space, but think about it through time. Think about it as a species as well as an individual. We need to tell a new story about human nature. You know, for the last 30 or 40 years, one of the big shifts in the changing story or changing narrative of human nature is, of course, that we're not just egoistic, individualistic beings, but we are empathic, collective, social beings. It's about me and about we. But I think, as well as the me and the we need to think about the short and the long, that we are creatures in the here and now. We are marshmallow driven creatures, but we are also acorn driven creatures. And I think we need to develop that capacity to think long term. We need to draw on the best work of thinking of artists and neuroscientists and psychologists and other people in this room and online and all around us, and put it towards thinking about how can we extend our time horizons and become the good ancestors that future generations deserve. Thank you very much. So let us speak, let us talk.
I would love to have one of those kimonos.
That was very hard to get the kimono, actually. The mayor of your harbour didn't quite want to give it up, but I managed to get one.
Maybe we should get some here in the centre.
Well, actually, you know, there's been some art projects in the Netherlands and other places where they've seen this stuff that I've talked about, future design, and they've developed their own clothing, hats, rituals, and so on, because you can sort of make it work for yourself.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there are many questions, but maybe you will allow me to ask the first question.
I allow you to ask the first question.
So one of the things that, of course, is very much of the here and now is this idea of existential risk.
Ah, right.
Well, I mean, it's not on the donut. I mean, how worried are you about AI? Should we really be worried about this?
Right. It's a big question. So some of you may know that there is one of the greatest philosophical scandals of the century going on as we speak. And this concerns what's called the effective altruism movement, which some of you may know about or be part of in various ways. But as you'll know, there's this huge scandal going on because of the recent collapse of a cryptocurrency trading firm. What's it called again? Yeah, FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, who calls himself an effective altruist. And as you might also know, the effective altruism movement is very much linked to Oxford University, to the Future of Humanities Institute, as well as other places too. But there are lots of people here involved with that, Will McCaskill and Toby Ord and others, who I have coffee with, Nick Bostrom. And the scandal is kind of in two areas. One is the fact that they've got a lot of their funding. And so let me say something else, that the effective altruism movement, which is kind of a utilitarian philosophical movement, has been championing the concept of long-termism in the last year or two, which is the idea that we need to take responsibility for future generations, in a sense, what I talk about, but I think there's a big difference between long-term thinking and long-termism. And the idea of long-termism has been the scandal's partly about the fact that there are these sort of super billionaire tech funders who've been funding them and who've collapsed, and there's questions around the ethics of that, and whether that funding has affected the kind of research that they do, and etc. But there's another set of questions around the conceptual coherence of long-termism, the ideas of existential risk, which I think which are also starting to get critiqued really seriously now. I mean, there have been dozens and dozens of critical articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, everywhere in the last even the last few weeks. And some of the critiques are around the failure of this movement to take into account certain kind of future risks, particularly around climate change and the ecological crisis. That the focus of the long-termists is very much on tech risks, particularly around AI. And the idea broadly is that, well, there's going to be billions and billions of human beings in the future, and we need to look at what could potentially wipe out all those human beings. There could be nothing worse than some kind of existential risk, as it's sometimes called, that wiped out humanity, and the one that's most likely to do it is probably something like a rogue AI that makes us all become batteries, like in the Matrix. And so the focus of the research and the funding's all been going towards things like AI and biotech risks, and very little has gone towards things like climate change. Why? Because climate change in the view of the long-termists and effective altruists, isn't the kind of thing that's going to wipe out humanity. It's not enough of an existential risk to really register. So if you look at Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, there's a table on page 167 which says that, well, there's a 1 in 10 chance that AI might wipe us out over the next 100 years, but only a 1 in 1,000 chance that climate change will. And what it means is that because the focus is so much on the kinds of things that might completely wipe us out, means near-term risks like the fact that 100 million people might die in floods in Bangladesh over the next 50 years don't get a look in. Yeah. And that's a really serious issue. And in fact, even more serious, I've read an article a few days ago in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, so a very respected journal, which talked about how in Will McCaskill's recent book called What We Owe the Future, which is a sort of a Bible of long-termism, the author of the article contacted 30 climate scientists who were mentioned in the acknowledgements to ask them whether they endorsed his views on climate change and had they been consulted, because in the book it talks about how humankind will survive and will be fine with about 7 degrees of heating, maybe even 15 degrees of heating. And no climate scientist I've ever spoken to has ever endorsed that view. And what the article shows that 20 out of the 30 people in the acknowledgements responded. And many of them, I think most of them, said, A, they don't remember ever being contacted, or maybe they were contacted by a research assistant but didn't know that it was about a book. And most of them did not endorse what was in the book. So there's this whole sort of set of critiques, and I think there are other ones as well. There's a belief in that kind of field that we can have endless economic growth, that tech problems are going to solve our problems. And Elon Musk famously recently endorsed this book, What We Owe the Future, which I'm not sure was very good for their PR now. But when I look at their work, and we come from the same place in the sense of ethics and future ethics, and I think that's important. But when you start doing your sort of rational utilitarian calculus, you start getting these weird conclusions like AI matters, something that's could have a big impact but is very, very improbable. And yet something like the climate crisis, which is very, very probable here and now, doesn't really get focused on. So I think this is a kind of an ideology which is misguided and dangerous. That's my view.
What do you think? I very much share your view. I think what you've given us today is a compelling case for why it is that long-term thinking and not long-termism is really where we should be. I mean, how can one endorse cancer? I mean, this is what growth is.
Yeah.
Right? Unlimited growth is cancer,
and
it will eventually wipe things out. And it's not really about the timescale, it's about doing what is right for the next generations.
Right, I think you need to draw on concepts like intergenerational justice or indigenous cosmologies or an empathic principle, things which are much more about human connection, actually.
And I think, of course, this is where things on chain for me, because if you think about human flourishing, it's very much about exactly those concepts. It's about being in communities. And long-termism never talks about that. They talk about this ultimate event that everything can be wiped out, when in fact it's also about flourishing here. It's not like, famously, of course, and this is where a lot of this comes from, is Wittgenstein said, we're not here to have fun, right? We're not here to enjoy ourselves. He never wrote that, but one of his friends reported that he would have said that. I think that's potentially misguided. I think what we need to do is to have flourishing communities. And I think what you've shown us today is a way of thinking about how we can continue to do that. But I won't monopolize. There are many other questions, please.
So, thanks. Thank you for the talk. From an ethical perspective, like, how do you weigh the opportunity costs of not doing something now, or suffering that exists right now, in order to kind of facilitate some betterment in the future? Is one life now worth 10 in the future? Does that decay as you go forward? From an ethical perspective, there is the idea that whatever suffering is here and now is more important, and how much more important, and also who is paying the brunt of that. So, like with the climate thing, there's a lot of a sense of if we change the way we produce food, maybe people here can afford it, and people in other parts of the world can't afford it, and it's good for the climate. And it's very nice for us to have this conversation here in Oxford and be very intellectual about it. But that suffering here and now could be more important than in the future.
Yeah, it's a fundamental question which goes back to the thing I just mentioned in passing a little bit ago, which is about the idea of discounting. And if you know this field of discounting, you know that businesses and governments use a kind of a methodology called discounting where they try and evaluate lives or utility or benefits of some kind in the future. So the classic sort of way it works is that when the UK Treasury is deciding whether to build a hospital, they will look at the benefits today and then they will discount or diminish the benefits that accrue in 10 or 20 years' time. So it's a bit like, as someone gets more and more into the distance, when you're looking at them, they get smaller and smaller. And that's what governments do all the time. That's why they tend not to invest in long-term things like, the Swansea Tidal Power Project was a classic one that was recently scuppered, or a couple of years ago, scuppered by the government, because the way the Treasury's their methodologies work is they don't put any benefits on anything that comes more than 60 years in the future, even though it was a 120-year project. So that's the sort of how it operates institutionally. And the guy who invented discounting, an economist in the 1920s called Ramsey, said, to discount the future of human life is a colossal failure of the imagination. He said something along those lines. But then that raised the question of, well, then how do you weigh up, right? Your exact question, the future and the present. I remember when I gave a draft of this book to a friend of mine to read, a guy called Kevin Watkins, who used to be the CEO of Save the Children. And he said, I really hate your book. And I said, why? He said, well, look, there are 115 million children who are dying of malnutrition right now, and you're telling me to care about future generations. This is just, immoral, he said. Anyway, we had a long discussion about this. And it turned out that about a month later, Save the Children put out a report talking about being good ancestors, which he'd drawn on the stuff I'd been writing. And what they pointed out in the talk was that, well, if you really care about malnutrition, healthcare, education, so on in low-income countries, then you need to do long-term investment in healthcare and education and all these different areas. It's about being a good ancestor. It's about doing things which benefit current generations, but embedding them so they benefit future generations as well. And if you ask someone like Sophie Howarth, who's the Future Generations Commissioner of Wales, your question, if you ask her that question, she'll say, well, what I tried to do, she would say, I don't want to put words in her mouth, is I try and focus on policies which benefit both current and future generations. Like try and find where's the intersection, and there's so much intersection, whether it's putting investment in renewable public transport or air pollution or all sorts of things, which has dual sort of benefits. But really, sometimes there are dilemmas between the present and the future. And the way I see it, it's ultimately about giving future generations a voice in the present, bringing them into the room, as I was talking about earlier, so you can actually have a discussion. Some of those discussions might be very difficult between the present and the future, also involving the global south and the global north and all those kinds of things. But I don't think you can have a fair discussion until you do this kind of thinking. And sometimes the decisions will be difficult, and sometimes weighing up the life of my daughter in 2100 versus someone who's in a care home today is going to be difficult, and the probabilities of how my actions might impact on them. But I think we're still so far away from having, I think, a cogent conversation about that. That's how I think about it.
I think we'll take two more questions from here, then we have one online, and then we can continue in here. So I think we have...
here and then there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. You put into a framework things that I've thought a lot about in a very understandable and thought-provoking way, so thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that concerns me, and I'd like to know your thoughts on this, is the effect of the internet on what you call fouling the nest. E.M. Forster, the novelist, wrote a book in about 1912 called When the Machine Stops. I don't know whether you've read it.
Yeah.
But what happens in that, the whole of humanity has become reliant on a machine, and they just don't know how to cope without it. And to me, what worries me is this disconnection between this new world that we've created of AI and driven by the internet, and our disconnection from what that lovely lady, can't remember her name,
Janine Benyus.
yes, was talking about looking after the planet and being connected to the planet and making sure that it's there for future generations. There seems to be a real disconnect there that is, from my point of view, sort of fouling our nest, as it were.
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I mean, that Ian Foster story is fantastic. There's also another early piece of sci-fi by Olaf Stapleton called Star Maker. He wrote this novel in the 1930s where he talks about a civilization where the people developed this technology, a kind of very complex kind of radio, because that was the technology of his day, that they could keep in their pocket, and just by touching it, they could have the experience of, climbing a mountain or doing this or having a party or whatever it was. And that what happens in the story is that the governments realize that people are so addicted to these radios that are in their pockets, that they start using the radios to broadcast kind of propaganda, and there's all sort of warfare and so on. And the end of the story is that, or that section of the story, is that while all that was going on, there was an ecological disaster happening on Earth, which was the loss of oxygen. And the people are so caught up in their phones, basically, that they are a century too late at dealing with the problem, and the civilization dies out. Yeah. And that was written in the 1930s. So, is there an answer to that? I have the same fears as you. I look at that. I look at my kids. My kids are really good at keeping technology at bay, and they use it to play online chess or whatever. They're not completely obsessed, yet I still look at the way that they're interacting with the world, know that this much of their life has switched from, or they've been born into 2 dimensions rather than 3 dimensions, and surely that impacts on the connection with place, even when, of course, in some ways we're just starting to learn to walk with this technology, with technology, starting to learn how to use them. Maybe, there were great hopes of the internet connecting human beings in the 1990s and creating human connection rather than creating a lonely planet, full of lonely individuals. So I don't have any solution to that. I just have those same fears that you have. That if our lives are as avatars, and our entertainment and so on as avatars, then one day somebody might invent a really good VR experience which is about long-term imagining. And I think that will happen, but most of the VR experiences will probably be entertainment about the long term. Certainly the VR stuff I've done, of course it can. As we've done, I've done some work with Morton and his old sort of lab work. You can feel emotions. If you could find ways of feeling that connection through time, and using technology that way, that could be a good thing. But I think it's probably going to get swamped by games about killing people. Yeah.
Thank you.
Wait, I think there's a question there, online.
We'll
and then
take
back.
one more and then go online.
Yeah.
So one more.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for a great talk and really important work. So my question, I'm a psychologist, mindfulness researcher, and to implement some of these principles, it seems to me that you need to kind of slow down a bit, because a lot of people are caught in this sort of frantic way of living, which you also described. And there's a mental health crisis, and lots of people on the edge of burning out. The young generation particularly sort of suffers a lot. The school pressure, whereas, there's a need to sort of have space for this kind of talk and thinking and changing of habits, and so in a way there's a conflict there, I think, and I wonder if you have any suggestions how to sort of, maybe you have to work with also the mental health crisis at the same time.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I think, what do I think about that? I think certainly, okay, let me tell you just a very brief story. So I met this Japanese Buddhist monk not long ago. He came to stay with me. His name's Shokai Matsumoto, and he's an expert in mindfulness. He's written a great book called A Monk's Guide to a Clean House and a Clean Mind. So he has a temple in Kyoto, where he invites CEOs to come at 7 o'clock in the morning and clean the temple before they go to work. He also has an online temple. He's written all these books. He's a very cool guy. And he's actually the translator of this book into Japanese. And I asked him, I said, why did you want to translate this book into Japanese and spend months of his life doing it? He said, well, in Japanese Buddhist, I said, well, I asked him, so why did you want to do this, especially given that I understood that Japanese culture had a lot of stuff about intergenerational connection built into it, honoring ancestors and so on, and also Buddhist culture as well. He said, well, the truth is that in Japan and in the two main Buddhist traditions in Japan, we do a lot of looking back at the past and connecting with ancestors in the past, but we don't actually really do that much looking towards the future. We do a certain amount of being in the present moment, and of course that is a way of transcending time through various kinds of meditative practices. He said, but even then, we're often trying to expand our sort of moral selves across space rather than through time. It's much more about, developing compassion for strangers or family or strangers in a sort of circle going outwards across space rather than through time. And so he said, the reason I translated your books because I wanted to change Japanese Buddhism. So it was much more focused on future generations. And I know this is sort of an indirect response to what your question was. And I said, well, what are you going to do? Actually do. And he said, well, I've started something called the Good Ancestor movement in Japan. And the first thing I want to do, he hasn't done this yet, he said there are 70, he's a very ambitious monk. He said there are about 70,000 Buddhist shrines and temples in Japan. He says, one day a year, I want to designate as a Good Ancestor Day where every temple or shrine does something, anything. It could be plant a tree, have a prayer, have a dialogue, do some kind of meditative immersion. It doesn't matter what it is. And that's part of what he's trying to do. But certainly it's the case that various forms of mindfulness have a capacity to help us extend our sense of time or transcend time. But how does that relate to the mental health crisis? And that's obviously a different kind of question. But certainly, it'd be interesting to have someone like Oren Lyons, the Haudenosaunee indigenous leader here, to answer that question. Maybe he would say something like, well, actually, part of our failure of mental health is because your culture is so cut off from the planet and other generations that actually the healing, he might say, I mean, again, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but the healing might come from rekindling some of those kinds of connections, which might find ways of helping with other dilemmas that we have. But of course, at any one moment in history, there's 1,000 different, dilemmas and conflicts and struggles and inequalities going on. But yeah, thanks for that. We've got an online question?
I think we've got 2 online questions. Elaine, if you want to start.
Yes, thanks, Roman. That was totally mind-blowing. I was on the edge of my seat the whole time. It was really incredible. But I wanted to ask you about climate justice, really. We've just had COP27 in Egypt, and it's very obvious that if we are going to, be able to get together and address these issues for the future, it means overcoming some of the current inequities and overcoming some of the current politics that make this coming together and acting together impossible. Now, Amitav Ghosh, the writer, in his book and lecture series, The Great Arrangement, argues that some of the wealthier people and nations in the world are actually taking a fairly relaxed attitude to climate justice, not only because they are reluctant to share resources and address any issues of reparations for the damages of colonialism and such things in the past, but also because they take a Malthusian approach, and to be crude, that they think they can ride out the climate crisis because mostly it will affect poorer people, and if there are fewer of them, they'll be fine, kind of thing. which is quite a terrifying thought. But then your FTX story tends to prove him right, at least in part. And so do you think there is any hope that we can somehow address these issues of massive inequalities so that people are perhaps more able and more willing to come together to address these problems? Or is it the case that until there is more of a sense of global justice around the sharing of resources, then we're just doomed, because people don't want to sacrifice whatever little they have if they have a sense that elsewhere people are just continuing, just getting on with business as usual?
Great, thanks for that brilliant question. I love Amitav Ghosh in that book, The Great Derangement, except for the fact that he's really negative about science fiction. And he's quite, because he's quite a literary kind of writer and thinker. But I think he's absolutely right, and that idea is absolutely right, that one of the core problems here is that what's sometimes called the idea of climate apartheid. A former head of the UN Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, whose name escapes me, he used this term, climate apartheid, I think first after Hurricane Sandy happened. And he pointed out that when Hurricane Sandy hit New York, rich people, and Goldman Sachs, in fact, had 10,000 sandbags and they had their own generators, but 500,000 New Yorkers, mostly people living in poverty, people of color, had no access to healthcare, education, transport, none like that. It was a total kind of inequality. And of course, that's exaggerated even more when it comes to the global north and the global south, as you say. And the question of reparations is hardly on the table. It's just hardly part of the conversation, yet clearly it must be part of the conversation. And it's incredible how the discourse around reparations has found it difficult to make headway. So just give you an example, my kids, right? My daughter came home from school the other day, and she was, in geography, they've been given some kind of graphic about carbon emissions, right? And it was showing how, North America has contributes to lots of carbon emissions, and so does India, and so does China. And I said, well, wait a minute, what about the historic emissions? Like, she was having to give a little speech about it. And she said, well, what do you mean? Well, the teachers hadn't, it's not really the teacher's fault, but it's the culture's fault. The teachers, she wasn't engaging with that issue of, well, what are the historic emissions of Europe and the United States? And I said, what about Australia? Because we're an Australian family, part Australian family. Australia has the highest per capita carbon emissions in the world, right? And that's about that historical issue. And this really relates to the core of what I'm talking about. I didn't mention it today, but when thinking about legacy, this is about thinking about the past as much as the future. It's about thinking about what we've inherited from the past and what we want to pass on. In some ways, we've inherited positive things from the past, or some people have. The benefits of medical discoveries by Jonas Salk, or cities that we live in like Oxford, which were built by laborers over the last hundreds of years. But of course, we're also the inheritors of legacies of slavery and colonialism and racism that create deep inequities that must now be repaired through reparations. We are the inheritors of economies that are structurally addicted to endless growth in fossil fuels, which we now need to transform. And those are questions about thinking about time, as you say, and I think reparations is the big one. I think the reality of the way human societies develop and the way civilizations collapse is that elites tend to hide very successfully from the impacts of their actions. They build walls, right? There's a lot of good research on this in the collapse of Mesoamerican civilizations. And in fact, you see it not long ago, the great US urban Marxist scholar Mike Davis died. He wrote a fantastic book called City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles. He wrote it when did he write that book?
70s.
Yeah. And it was all about the walls that were being built up, about gated communities. Well, the global north is the ultimate gated community, in a sense. So actually, I have very dark thoughts about our capacity to engage. And let me say one more thing, sort of a more positive light. I'm a member of an organization called the Club of Rome, which in the 1972 published something called The Limits to Growth Report, which was this huge bestseller, 12 million copies sold, and it was all about how we needed to get off the growth gravy train. And there's just been a 50-year update to The Limits to Growth published called Earth for All. And in the organization, which is a very sort of white, global, north-dominated organization, there were big debates from economists, particularly from the global south, from India, Jayati Ghosh and others, saying, why aren't we talking about reparations? Why aren't we talking about the climate crisis in terms of the impacts on the global south? So I'm pleased to say that that report now has a lot of material on that, but these kind of conversations need to happen everywhere, and I don't hold out great hope. Sorry about that.
We'll take one more online, Nika.
Sorry my answers are so long, but good questions. What can I do? Nika,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Roman, as well for the presentation. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. But I have a question, maybe a little bit shifting from the top-down to like bottom-up approach. So kind of just given the huge volatility and uncertainty and the complexity and the ambiguity of the world that we are right now, and like literally even this week, right? So we kind of feels when the world is on fire with the war, with the protests, like in Iran and China, when the FTX collapse and everything else that we can think of, how in this kind of situation, kind of both as individuals and as community members and members of a larger society, how do you actually keep focus on kind of future generation and that long-term future? And at the same time, maybe I take back a little bit kind of from where you started, right? You started from empathy. And I wonder also how can we be more like in this stage or in kind of right now in this moment, more empathetic towards ourselves, but also kind of others who are less engaged in, thinking about the future and how we can contribute.
Great, thanks for that. The first part of the question reminds me of something, the conversation I had with my father. One of the issues that often comes up around this is, well, isn't long-term thinking a matter of privilege? That only when you're in a stable society or life or household or whatever, do you have the sort of luxury to think long-term when there's so much other stuff going on now. You're a refugee just trying to survive. You're trying to put food on your children's table. There are the crises of the moment. So I remember speaking to my dad about this, and he was saying, well, don't forget that my dad was a refugee from Poland to Australia after the Second World War. And he said, the families who are carrying their children across the Mediterranean in dinghies are risking their lives for a better future. They're thinking not just about now and the civil war that they might be fleeing, which is real, of course, but they're thinking about, well, what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years or 50 years to my own children? And the point the point I want to make there is that long-term thinking isn't a luxury. I think it's very deeply embedded in who we are, in that sort of anthropological sense of us being intergenerational beings. And I think it's always hard to step back from the cacophony of the present. And I find it difficult. I used to work on human rights in Guatemala. I used to work with refugees, indigenous people in the Guatemalan jungle, stuff here and now. I saw children dying in front of my eyes. And it's been a long journey to not forget that, but to try and also somehow bring in these issues around intergenerational justice and try and feel okay about that. And I don't always feel okay about that, because I know what's still happening in Guatemala right now in communities where I spend time. What I do know, though, and this connects to the question about the uncertainty of the future. I think one of the challenges here, well, if this future is so uncertain as well, how would we know what to do? Why should we do anything if there's all this kind of chaos? And the way I think about that is that I think in some ways the future is incredibly uncertain. There are, particularly in the areas of technology. I don't know if the year 2049 is going to be like Blade Runner 2049 and machines have taken over. But on the ecological side, I think we know a hell of a lot. We know more than we've ever known about the ecological trajectory of our planet, which is that, we are heading with business as usual towards 3 to 4 degrees of heating, 1 to 2 meters of sea level rises at least. I mean, there's variation there, but we know that we need air to breathe and water to drink and food to eat. We know what the basics are, and that's something I think which can cut across different kinds of social cleavages. In terms of empathy, and what is the journey there? You know, Morten and I, as I mentioned, are both involved in this empathy museum, and one of the exhibits is called A Mile in My Shoes, where you can, as you might know, you can literally put on a pair of shoes of a stranger and you listen to a story of them talking about their life and you immerse yourself in them. But I've always thought, well, how do we create a version of that exhibit which is about stepping into the shoes of the future, that help us stretch our empathy through time and across place? And I haven't yet thought of anything really good. You know, maybe when the VR technology gets better, maybe there'll be something there. Maybe it's something to do with putting on a gown like future design, these kind of ritualistic immersions. And in a way, that's part of the answer, is about ritual. How do we create rituals in society which connect us through time as much as across space?
I guess it's also why we are so excited by science fiction, right? In many ways, that is how we connect with future generations. I know that's one of the reasons why I read so much sci-fi.
Yeah, and sci-fi also is really good at positing experimental moral dilemmas, moral worlds, like, I don't know, Ursula Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed. You know, is that a different way of organizing? You know, there's an anarchist planet, Anaris. Is that another way of organizing society? Or the novels of Kim Stanley Robinson, which do the opposite. In a way, they talk us about a trajectory of challenge.
Yeah,
and it's messy. Stand the Man.
Ministry of the Future, very
Yeah.
strongly recommended. We have more questions in the room. There was one over there, maybe?
One there, and then one here, and then one... wait, you first, sorry. Yeah.
No, I mean, I suppose what comes to mind for me, obviously, in this time of hyper individualism, it is about how we actually and how we encourage this long-termism, and how we actually, and what are the mechanisms and to actually enable our society today, because we can discuss the theory of it, but we ultimately have to see what will create that societal change. Do you believe that is a possibility through evoking empathy and make people truly care to make change?
I think that I once wrote a report for Oxfam called How Change Happens, where I reviewed theories of change across 14 different academic disciplines. And the main conclusion I came to is that transformative change rarely happens without huge disruption from below, from collective action, from breaking of rules. And I cannot see how that we'll deal with any of the stuff we've been talking about unless we engage in that kind of disruption. It isn't for everyone, you know, but so the kinds of things that like Just Stop Oil are doing, or Extinction Rebellion, or the tire extinguishers, if you know about them, what's sometimes called the radical flank effect. You have mainstream movements. You always need mainstream movements, but then you also need the more radical movements to galvanize change. I mean, the classic example is in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, where you had the mainstream movement around Martin Luther King Jr., then you had the Black Power movement. And the white liberal establishment was afraid that in the end, that if they didn't agree to the demands of the mainstream movement, then more and more people would go towards the Black Power movement, which was much more radical and militant and so on. So I believe in the power of what's called the radical flank effect. There's a very interesting book written about this by Andreas Malm called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. He's a Swedish social historian, activist. I really recommend his book. He was here speaking not long ago. But of course, disruptive action by itself isn't enough. I mean, the way I think about it, sort of let's say a broad theory of crisis or response to crisis is, I think of it as sort of a triangle. In order to have transformative change, you need at the top of the triangle, you need an actual crisis going on. Floods, droughts, hurricanes, wars, whatever it is. Yeah. And then you need new ideas around in society that can replace what used to be there. So, for example, after the 2008 financial crash, some people said, well, you had the crisis, the financial crisis, but you didn't have the new economic models around to take its place. So we ended up just bailing out the bankers and having more of what we already had. And the third corner is the disruptive social movements. And when you've got, when I look at human history, when you've got a combination of those three things, that's when we sometimes have that shift. But lots of things play into those shifts to create the right ideas that are hanging around. It's not just about philosophers writing books. It's about artists changing the conversation in society. It's about photographers showing us monarch butterflies. It's about the things which change what I call the ethnosphere. So we need a biosphere to help us breathe, and we need the ethnosphere, which is the kind of cultural air we breathe. It's the ideas, assumptions, and beliefs which shape our worldviews, our Weltanschauung, to use the phrase from Karl Mannheim, the great 1920s German sociologist. It's about, and we all can be part of changing what the ethnosphere looks like. But the problem is, ultimately, can we do it fast enough? You know, and that's why understanding how crises work is so important. Yeah.
So this may be a little bit related to what you're just talking about, but I was thinking about what you mentioned about, you know, before we start looking at Elon Musk and going to space, we kind of need to fix the base here. But even on a more granular level, how important do you see individual well-being and individual mindfulness and mindsets to being able to contribute to the collective movement? I mean, if people are, you know, drinking and smoking and ravaging their own bodies, do you see that to be interrelated with how they might be able to think about the long term and the collective, or are those two independent?
I think that I sort of feel somewhat post-individual in my thinking about this, that I think we're at a moment of human history where it's going to be collective action which creates transformative change. But of course, you can't create collectivities without people being in themselves. You know, what's that famous Aristotle quote? Something like, all friendly feelings for others are an extension of man's feeling for himself, right? So there's something about self-love which is important to create human connection. And if you are not at ease with yourself, then it's hard to make those kinds of connections. So of course, I don't think there's the waves of change we need require the connections between individuals, but I'm particularly interested in forms of, let's say, spiritual practice which have collective ethos behind them. So ideas of socially engaged Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, that kind of stuff. You know, I think that's really fundamental because it kind of, it marries the sort of spiritual well-being with becoming part of something larger than yourself. And I'd say more broadly in this area, I kind of think like, you know, I'm not a religious person, but I recognize the power of religion to change societies. And the kind of good news is that the global environmental movement, the biggest social movement in all human history, is kind of like a giant decentralized religion with lots of different organizations who all worship Gaia, the goddess of earth, in some different way, not always explicitly, but they're all kind of trying to do the same thing. And I think, right, a decentralized religion is not a bad way to go. And it actually, I think it provides part of that spiritual nurturing, which is the stuff of collective action.
I think we'll do 2 more questions maybe, and then we'll go downstairs and have some coffee, and you can ask more questions.
I think you had a question there, and then back there. And
maybe 2 more. 3.
Okay, I'm going to answer really fast now. Here we go, see if I can do this.
Well, you've half answered it, so thank you very much for your talk. For me, you introduced a lot of really interesting concepts. And in that final question, you came on to I think the start of the question I wanted to ask, which is how much of a role you think secularism may have within the becoming of a good ancestor, because you talked a few times about indigenous peoples and their connection with earth and so on. And I was trying to piece it together as to whether I had an opinion on whether it would or wouldn't be useful, and your point there about a decentralized religion that is thinking about the environment, I think is a good way of thinking about it. And then related to that was in your sort of thought experiment with us just there, when we stood up and we thought about someone we care about and then empathize with someone we care about. One of the thoughts I had there was that actually that's still quite a selfish act, in the sense that you're using empathy for me to care about someone else.
Yeah.
But I don't independently care about them unless I've gone through that. Do you think that's necessary?
Yeah. So on the first part, I once asked Richard Dawkins, I said, don't you think the global environmental movement is like a big decentralized religion, and that actually it's doing something good? It's getting us to have a kind of almost religious-like connection with the earth. And his answer was really surprising. He said, I have to admit, I mean, these weren't his exact words, but he said, I have to admit that in an instrumental kind of way, getting people to care, to sort of worship the earth, might help save human civilization, is basically what he said. He could see a sort of a rational, instrumental justification for positing some kind of spiritual connection to the earth, just we've got to do whatever we can, And I thought that was a really, really interesting kind of answer to it. I was also very struck doing my research. One of the things I did is I went to the Vatican to talk to the Vatican about the Catholic Church's attitude to long-term thinking, because famously in the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, which came out in 2015, it talks about intergenerational solidarity, intergenerational connection. Again, I'm not a religious person, but I recognize that this was a massive deal, because when I later did some events with Catholic organizations in Europe, social action organizations, they were having to shift what they were doing from, basically they've always tended to do a lot of anti-poverty sort of work. And now they were trying to think about a lot of environmental stuff, particularly, and intergenerational stuff. And there was a struggle for them in all sorts of ways, partly because those environmental struggles were connected with the political left, but the Catholic Church in Poland is connected with the right, and so that's very complex. But secular, non-secular, I think we're all going to have to go at it in different ways. I'm not sure there's going to be a complete sort of formula. But on the question about whether it's sort of, I guess, instrumental again, using my daughter to make the leap to something more universal. Some people, you can show them that big orange circle, and that's all they need. You show them that, they go, oh my God, I haven't thought about all those people in the future. That changes me. And I think that's partly where effective altruism is coming from, actually. It's about a kind of almost like a rational weighing up of the scales. And that, there are people who respond to something like that who, they don't need to go via their daughter, as it were. I think for most of us need to find ways of, a bit like there's the photograph of the fireflies down there. It's sort of finding ways of cuteness, all sorts of things about ways of sort of activating connection in whatever ways you can in order to do that. So I don't feel kind of bad about that. I just think it's something very human about who we are and our embeddedness in lineages. I am very struck in the way some cultures, like in Maori culture, there's a sense that my ancestors are not just people, but they're also whales and rivers and forests, and therefore so are my descendants. And that's a very powerful thing. Probably better go.
Two more questions.
At the back there, then. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no. Thanks for the talk. It was interesting to hear. I mean, I was immediately thinking about that sort of passed down anecdote, which is probably not true entirely. Where with this foreign diplomatic envoy comes to China during Mao and asks Mao, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" And he says, "Well, I think it's too early to tell." Actually.
Yeah.
So and this sort of leads me into the question of, because if we substitute the French Revolution for climate change in this part, then we get a sort of more or less humorous picture, right? So it's this thing of how do you know when the past is being actualized in the future? Like how do you recognize when the past and the present has turned into the future in order to be able to render it sort of actionable? And the other thing I was thinking about here is this idea of futurity. I would love to hear you sort of parcel that a bit more, because there is expectation, there is anticipation, there is hope, there is possibility, there is potentiality, and these modalities, as they are lived and experienced as both individual and collective phenomenon, lead to various different ways of engaging with the world, right? And not all of them are quite positive. Some of these futurities are quite retractive, no? In terms of climate catastrophe in our little conversation, like we have some pretty dark ideas about what this would lead to, right? So there's this, I would wonder if we because I really enjoy the attention to futurity, but if we can parcel out or hear you reflect upon how you would think of modalities of futurity, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the China sort of anecdote's interesting, because my understanding of that was that he thought he was being asked about the French Revolution, but actually he was responding, thinking that the question was actually about the 1968 Paris uprisings, that revolution. And so when he was saying it's too early to tell, he was actually only talking about something 4 years ago. But in fact, there are a million other stories in sort of Chinese culture which have partly tried to tap into that sense of, well, this is a civilization with millennia of history, even if they totally raze to the ground their heritage buildings all the time and so on. But in terms of parceling out and parsing the future more, it's a really good question. I think, of course, I've tried to do it in a kind of, I'm not a futurist, and obviously there's a whole communities of futurists, and I know some of them through the Long Now Foundation, where I'm a research fellow and that kind of stuff, and they're probably the better people to ask, because I guess the way I've tried to parse things out is through these sort of 6 different forms of long-term thinking, which are, of course, somewhat different from the idea of what are the different ways of thinking about the plurality of futures, that are coming. And I think, in a way, your question had all sorts of answers in it, right? About possibilities and probabilities, and there's different ways of thinking about, the classic idea when futures thinkers they draw a cone of possibility, and you've got things happening now, and then you've got more and more improbable, or things are hard to predict the further that you go out. You've got wild cards and stuff like that. And I look at those diagrams and they always drive me crazy, because I feel that they're not breaking things down enough, for example, into categories like global north, global south, questions of inequality, questions of structures of power, as well as how likely things are or not to happen. And so, of course, one can slice the cake in lots and lots of different ways, but maybe we can talk about this afterwards, because I'd love to hear actually what you have to say about that, 'cause it sounds like you've thought about it more than I have.
No.
I think it's really interesting you met with the Vatican, because I was going to, at the risk of sounding sacrilegious, I was going to ask you how your kind of conception of long-term, short-term interacts with that of religion and the afterlife and the emphasis on, heaven and hell and judgment day. So there seems to be kind of like a prescription within religion as well, kind of focusing on the future, but it's not a future that is in this world, but in the hereafter. So how can we kind of bring that back to earth?
Yeah, it's a good question, because of course a lot of religions which have a sort of millenarium sort of idea of some judgment day, you find that the followers of those religions often don't care about what's going to happen in 100 years or 50 years or whatever, and they are saying, well, what can we do?
Yes.
So let's just live our lives and the judgment will come. And I think what is kind of interesting in, say, the Catholic tradition there, to at least the way it's expressed in things like that papal encyclical, is much more kind of grounded, not in ideas of heaven and hell and judgment and so on, but an idea of kind of stewardship, which you also find in lots of different religions. Some kind of sense that we've inherited a gift, a planet created by whoever, and what right do we have to not pass it on in a fit state? And I think that kind of idea is such a common denominator amongst religions and different cultures and so on. You can find something like that everywhere, in the same way that you can find the empathic principle of do unto others as you have them do unto you in almost every culture. And I think it's almost about working with those common threads to shift away from the disaster scenario religion, of the judgment day, to something much more grounded in both stewardship but also human relationships for those we care about through time.
Well, that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, Roman. Thank you very much. We need coffee and further refreshments downstairs.
Great, fantastic. And thank you for online people for listening.